what you know about the biblical narrative, and to just remind you that God chose to frame his biblical narrative in a language of generations, beginning with the generation of the heavens and the earth. You go through an account of 10 human generations from Adam to Jacob. Matthew captures the very center of the redemption story around Christ in Matthew 1:17. Matthew says, there were 4 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. Right there at the very center of the mission story of God. You remember that Jesus commissioned his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. The verse 20 ends with a promise. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. I suggest to you that in the Great Commission, Jesus had a double commission: to make disciples of all nations, globally, geographically, ethnically, and to the very end of the age, generationally. Our senior leaders and friends at the 1974 Lausanne Congress had that striking challenge made by Ralph Winter when he spoke about our cultural neighbors who have been unreached with the gospel. Our panel is bringing you a new challenge as we speak about younger leaders and intergenerational discipleship today. Many younger leaders in the church today are frustrated. They see the church as irrelevant, unloving, and sometimes not authentic enough. As we celebrate 50 years of Lausanne at this Congress, who here cares that 62% of younger leaders in some part of the world are leaving the church before they are 18? Our conversation will focus on 4 core values for healthy intergenerational disciple-making journeys with younger leaders. And I want to say a big thank you to the Congress team for the cube they have behind us. You've done great. We're speaking about friendship, vulnerability, mutuality, and collaboration. Let me say, Ole Magnus and I are only facilitators. Our speakers for this morning's panel are our 4 younger leaders here, and I will invite Ole Magnus and Sam to start us off.
Thank you, Nana, for this sobering information about 62% leaving church before they are 18. That was also the story of my life. It all died out when I was 17, till Jesus found me when I was 22, reading the Gospel of John and finding Jesus as a friend. But Sam, you are 24. You are still part of the church. Which part has friendship meant for you in your life?
Thanks, Ole Magnus. Well, one of the experiences that really profoundly shaped my vision of friendships, and what actually marked the beginning of my journey with the Lausanne movement 2 years ago to this week, was when I was invited to be part of the Lausanne Generations Conversation program team. And I remember what stood out to me about the invitation from the program chair, Lindsay, was that she emphasized it was just as much an invitation into friendship as it was to plan a conference. We had leaders from 5 different generations there, and as the youngest leader, I remember when we gathered together, being so struck by the posture of humility and honor towards one another. Everybody had a voice. And it was in that setting, as we looked at the core values that Nana mentioned, we realized that friendship was not just another value to go alongside collaboration, but it is in fact the best foundation for collaboration. And we see this modeled in the life of Jesus. I think of when he leads his 3 closest friends up the mountain, Peter, James, and John, and he becomes radiant in glory before them. It proves to be a marking encounter. And it's the same 3 friends that he leads to the deepest place of suffering in Gethsemane. It was friendship in the heights, and it was friendship in the depths. It was friendship that was real. And church, what I'm perceiving among the emerging generation is a shift away from collaboration that is built on win-win relationships, where we invest and expect something in return. But I really see that God is calling us to lose-lose-win relationships, where I pour out everything I have, you pour out everything that you have, and Jesus gets the glory. And I believe it's this form of friendship, thank you, this form of friendship that will pave the way for the revival that generations have been longing for. It begins with a recognition that revival moves at the speed of relationship.
Last year, Sam, you established a cohort around friendships. Please share a little more about that one.
For sure. Well, when I began my journey with Revive Europe 2 years ago, I found myself stuck in a psalm. It was Psalm 24, which in many ways I believe is a revival psalm. In it, we read about a generational call to ascend the mountain of God with clean hands and pure hearts. And a dream began to form in my own heart to connect younger leaders with a shared desire to respond to this call to consecration. So with the help of Leighton Ford Ministries, we established the Ascend cohort. We had 10 younger leaders from 6 European nations. And our desire, first and foremost, was just to build deeper friendship with one another. We were meeting monthly on Zoom to deepen our friendships and also invite more experienced leaders to invest in our own leadership. And this culminated with a time in Cairo back in March. We were honored to be hosted by Ramez Attallah, that I met through the Lausanne movement and who you've heard already this week. And in the chaos of Cairo, we wanted to make space for 2 things. We did an inductive Bible study of Paul's second letter to Timothy and created space for listening prayer, not looking to solve the problems that each of us were facing, but simply to listen and to ask God, what is your invitation for this person? And through this experience, we learned that nothing builds friendship like gathering around God's word and in prayer. And we were also honored to spend the week with Ramez and Rebecca Attallah, and it was their example of faithful leadership in Cairo over many, many years that inspired us to realize that this emerging generation, Gen Z, doesn't need more leaders who will simply appear for a few years and then disappear. What this generation is crying out for is those who will lead for decades, and that will only happen in the context of deep friendship.
Sam, you have mentioned relationship between the different generations now, and here we are, all the generations. So what would be your advice and encouragement to each of the generations here?
To the younger leaders in the room, a lot of whom got to meet together last night, I would say get ready. There is an invitation of God to this generation to ascend the mountain with clean hands and pure hearts. It's an invitation of surrender. It is an invitation of wholehearted pursuit. And God is not primarily looking at our ability, but at our availability. I believe He's calling forth a generation of consecrated hearts. And in 2 Chronicles 16, verse 9, it says that the eyes of the Lord roam throughout the earth to strengthen the hearts of those fully committed to Him. Gen Z, will His searching eyes find us? Where are the Calebs, the Joshuas, the Esthers, the Daniels? Recently, I was on a prayer retreat in the south of France, and as I was looking out over the hillsides, the Lord showed me a picture in my mind. I saw the younger generation lining the hills, and they were getting ready for battle. They were all in unique armor. They came in all shapes and sizes from many different nations, and they were giving a war cry. But as the picture developed, I saw the senior leaders, the spiritual fathers and mothers, and they were stood behind them. They had their hands on the shoulders of the younger leaders, and I could hear them saying, "I'm with you. You've got this. I'm not going anywhere." And I knew in that moment that without these senior leaders, the younger leaders would turn away. They would flee from the battle lines. They would be picked off from the enemy. And so I'm here to say, as a younger leader, to all of the senior generations in this room, from the bottom of my heart, we need you. We need you. It is impossible for my generation to fulfill the calling of God on our lives without experienced leaders who are willing to be a shade over our boldness and to intercede for our healing. Josiah had a Hilkiah. Timothy had a Paul. Joshua had a Moses. And I believe that it is this posture of humility and honor between the generations that will pave the way for the King of Glory to come riding in. So just to leave with a question, which we'll come back to at the end. If you are a senior leader, who are the younger leaders 20 years below you that you are intentionally investing in with that lose-lose-win posture? And to younger leaders in the room, how are we positioning ourselves to receive from the wisdom and the experience of older generations? We can't do this on our own. We need each other.
What a challenging invitation to intergenerational friendship. Thank you, Sam. Delphine, you lead me for real in Cameroon. Vulnerability is core to your heart. What role would you say vulnerability plays in intergenerational discipleship and friendship?
Thank you, Nana. Vulnerability is a very essential part of deep connections between people. As Brené Brown will put it, being vulnerable is being brave enough to show up and be seen, even when there are no guarantees of the outcome. As a concept in our cultures, vulnerability is not really celebrated. And yet at the same time, it is hard to be fully seen and known without vulnerability. And whenever one cannot be fully seen or known, the kind of depth that is necessary for lasting impact is missing. So vulnerability is scary, we have to admit. And it is so because you're putting the power in another person's hands to let us down. And yet, if love is the process of meeting needs, then vulnerability is the bridge to experiencing love. So without vulnerability, deep life-on-life friendships with individuals of any generation become significantly compromised. Especially in intergenerational friendships, there is usually a power dynamic. And so a lot of intentionality is needed for this power dynamic to be overcome so that vulnerability can happen. And it is, so that it is vulnerability that will grease this process of deep engagement. And yet as we gather here this morning, Nana, here's a question on my mind. Are we willing to be vulnerable with one another as generational neighbors in order to develop this kind of depth of authenticity that is needed for effective discipleship?
Wow, a deep question I hope that you will come back to around your tables. Deep words, Delphine. Dig a little deeper with us in the conversation. Generally, and from your own personal experience, how will you encourage, what would you share with Congress participants on how we can take practical steps to nurture vulnerability in our friendships?
Thank you. A lot of us have suffered hurt in past relationships, and we still carry wounds that are bleeding from having risked vulnerability in communities and with people that did not know what to do with it. And so because of this, there is need for safety to be established in order for people to find the courage to risk being vulnerable again. However, though safety is needed and safe environments are necessary, there is a shortage of those safe spaces in the church today. So the question very quickly becomes, who will risk being vulnerable first? Because in order for us to melt the ice and ensure safety, we must each determine to love those who dare to bring it all to the table, not less, but more for doing so. And so as members of the body of Christ, each of us must therefore stop trying to find that safe space and start becoming it for others. This is something which, like Sam just mentioned, Jesus modeled for us in the Garden of Gethsemane with his 3 disciples. Even though he knew that they were going to let him down, he invited them to stand with him. And yet, despite falling asleep, despite the fact that these disciples fell asleep, when Jesus needed them to be with him, Jesus' vulnerability, bringing them into that moment, so impacted them that they went out and became safe spaces to so many others. And in some ways, we all are sitting here today because they risked being vulnerable. And so although inviting others into my good, my bad, and my ugly in a world where appearances matter is often not easy, keeping up appearances unravels the very fabric of the hope that we want to pass on to the younger generation, which is Christ's priceless love. The world today needs to see Christians who, in addition to trusting God, also trust others with themselves. And this truth hit home for me a few years ago when my nieces and nephews came to live with me. Not long after they arrived, it became very clear to me that there were some issues in my personal life that I needed to work on. And so I had the choice, will I do that in private or would I invite them into the process? And choosing the latter, I decided to bring them in. And I was really surprised by the outcome because besides holding me accountable and praying for me, they soon started asking me questions like, Auntie Della, what should I do about this? What do you think about that? And so you realize that my vulnerability suddenly expanded the space of growth from my life only to their lives as well. And so as we wrap up this brief conversation on vulnerability, as you consider this value in intergenerational discipleship, what is more important to you? Is it that people are impressed by you or that they are influenced by you?
Thank you, Delphine. As a father and a grandfather, I recognize how children can help us to mature through their honesty and their directness. So thank you, thank you. Jokabed, you have something to share with us coming from an indigenous background. Please, what would you like to share with us?
Thank you, Ole Magnus. I would like to share this question with the metaphor of the mola. Look at this beautiful mola, sewn with threads of various colors and metaphors. Each thread represents a unique person, each color a different culture and experience. Each pattern shows the interdependence of relationships. The layers represent the diversity of generation. This is the work of the mola, a masterpiece created by Kuna Dule woman. This is the reality of indigenous community, where the concept of mutuality is deeply rooted in our way of life. Now, let us imagine the Church of Christ as a mola. We are a diverse community, united by a shared faith, united by the Spirit of life, united by Jesus. Just as the molas is sewn together with integrated patterns, so is the church. Each member plays a vital role, bringing his or her unique gift and experiences. Without the thread of interdependence, our community would be incomplete. Without the knot of the mola, we will not learn to appreciate the difference that often divide us, but should rather bind us. We must listen to understand others, recognize and value our differences as an opportunity to grow as a complex and beautiful church. This is the reality of our community. I would like to share an example. I am part of the Indigenous Memories. This is a community when indigenous and non-indigenous, brother and sister, collaborate. Our sometimes feel like knots in the fabric of our community. For example, when we are planning a workshop, we had a hard time agreeing on the best approach. But then, as a community, we dialect and remember that our difference could be a source of strength. Maybe you sometimes feel that in your community and your church, but we have to remember we are diversity in our church. We are diversity, but we are united in Jesus Christ. By listening to each other and seeing the world through different lenses, we will be able to create a more inclusive and meaningful workshop. It's a powerful reminder that even the most difficult knots can be tied together with empathy and understanding. Yet, in a world often values individual achievement over community, the question I want to do, how we can offer a church, how can we foster a church that truly embodies the spirit of mutuality? As the prophet Joel says, I will pour out my spirit on all generations. Are we truly living out this promise in our churches? Are we fostering a community where children, youth, adults, and the elderly people from all walks of life feel valued and connected? This is the heart of the mission, the mutuality, emerge from the seeds of love. Mutuality challenges us to tear down the walls that separate us. If the gospel we preach is the gospel of Jesus, this wall will be torn down by love. When domination sits in life poison, corrupting our relationships and community, we have we must not allow it. We have to be united with the power of love. This is the importance of mutuality, because many of the time, some ideas can want to divide us, but we must not allow it, because the mutuality is a powerful face of the face of God. As a churches and community, we have to be together and fight against violence and toxic power sometimes emerge from our perspective. But we have a good news in Jesus Christ. The good news is come from the power of the mutuality and the powers of love.
So would you say, Jokabed, that there is something very special that we can learn from the indigenous church regarding mutuality?
Yeah, we have a lot to learn about indigenous perspectives and community. Many of the time when I'm talking with many people, I ask, what do you learn about indigenous community? The majority of example is not good for indigenous people. But we as a church, we know all culture has something to show in our perspective and to show indigenous community and churches offer a holistic vision of community in terms of relationships with all creation, including human beings, from a place of conviviality and coexistence than dominance and exploitation and colonialism. For example, in a world and a church where humans are the center of everything, indigenous people have understood for God's creation that all things are interconnected and interdependent, and that we must live in mutuality for all to live fully. But that perspective is important because when I'm thinking about salvation, we have to understand the salvation of Jesus is cosmic salvation. Then the indigenous churches can offer to the community and the global church this understanding about holistic vision, the salvation. This salvation is integrated. My healing is not only possible in all religion are healing a whole. In other words, our salvation is important when we understand Jesus savor all land and earth and the community. In other side, if all relations are important and my grandmother and grandparents on, then we recognize that all lifestyle positive or negative affect the life of all creation as well as future generation. Embracing faith in Jesus implies living a simple, generous life which contrasts sharply with consumerism, having and accumulating what we do not need violently, affect the earth and all relation with others, especially the most vulnerable people around the world. From the indigenous church, we learn to embrace different cultures, but we learn a lot about to listen each other and to understand each culture has unique things to show and to learn from each other. Finally, as we stand and are circle and listen to the song interpreted by indigenous people, by my elder, they sing that song. Ay, ye, de, gi, ye. And when you heard this song, the grandmother and grandfather say, I planted the tree,